All right, can you all hear me well? Good. So first of all, it's a pleasure for me to be part of this symposium. I'm looking forward to the rest of it and also to be part of discussions on how we can have collaboration perhaps in the future between Yale and Todai. The past discussion was a perfect lead up to my talk. I'm going to continue to talk about aerosols. I'm going to talk about the effect that aerosols can have on ice clouds today. And there's a role to play for those effects both in climate forcing and also in a recently proposed geoengineering mechanism. And I've decided to focus mostly on my work on this geoengineering mechanism today. So I've listed my collaborators for that work below. So I want to start by giving you a short outline of my talks. I'll continue to talk about black carbon for a little bit because I knew that Professor Kondo would talk about that. And talk about also the importance of aerosol effects on clouds in that context. And then I'll move on to talk about cirrus seeding of cirrus clouds. And this is a geoengineering mechanism that was proposed a few years ago. And we've been studying this lately, and so I'm going to try to address the questions of how much to seed, where to seed, when to seed, and how much cooling we could possibly get from this kind of geoengineering mechanism. And then talk about the climate response that we see in our modeling to this kind of geoengineering. So when I heard that Professor Kondo was going to come to Yale, I was very excited, and I looked up some of his publications, and I discovered that we were actually co-authors. And there's an excuse for me not being aware of that, and that's that we are 2 out of 31 co-authors on this study that came out this summer. It was a big review on the effect of black carbon on climate. And it made a big splash. It received a lot of attention, especially from policymakers when it came out, because one of the conclusions from that paper was that black carbon is in fact the second largest climate warmer after carbon dioxide. This contradicted the last IPCC report, which had methane being the second most important climate warmer. But in this paper, they came up with this, or we came up, I should say, with this larger estimate of how much black carbon warms climate. And I think part of the reason why it received so much attention and the reason why policymakers were excited was that the steps that we need to take to reduce black carbon, people seem to be a little more comfortable with them than the steps that we need to take to reduce CO2 emissions, which usually that involves major changes in our lifestyle. So people were excited about this prospect of reducing the positive forcing of climate by reducing black carbon emissions. And so the recommendation from this paper was that we reduce emissions from diesel engines and also cook stoves. And so this figure here, Professor Kondo also showed, and here's the estimate that causes this climate forcer to be the second most important warming component after CO2. So the best estimate here was a 1.1 watts per meter squared warming. That can be compared to 1.7 watts per meter squared for CO2 between pre-industrial times and present day. Whereas methane, I think the best estimate in the last IPCC report was 0.5 watts per meter squared. What was perhaps not as well communicated in the press release was that black carbon is not emitted in isolation. It's co-emitted with other species that are not necessarily warming. So when you account for this effect of the co-emitted species, you actually get a small cooling and not a warming. That's not necessarily the case for all different sources, and hence this recommendation of reducing emissions from diesel engines and cook stoves, because these emissions have enough dominance of black carbon that it would benefit climate to reduce them. Now, my contribution or my expertise in the context of this paper was the way that black carbon can influence clouds. And essentially, I was able to tell them that we don't really understand anything about them, which is perhaps not something to be proud of. Well, it's not completely true. So particularly my expertise here is on how black carbon can affect these cold clouds, mixed phase clouds, and ice clouds. And the reason why we're so uncertain about these processes, I will say, is largely because the lab community of my field haven't been able to tell us how well black carbon particles can act as ice nuclei in the atmosphere. So I will argue that we do have a fairly good understanding of these clouds if we were just told how efficient black carbon was as an ice nuclei. And so I want to move on now to talk about these so-called cold clouds or ice clouds and how aerosols can potentially affect them, and how it could be how aerosols could actually have a very strong effect on climate through these clouds. So a nice schematic here showing the types of ice-containing clouds that we have in our atmosphere. For the most of my talk, I'm actually going to be focusing on cirrus clouds, which are always ice, and they have temperatures colder than minus 40 degrees C in the atmosphere. And then there's this whole temperature range where we find mixed phase clouds, so clouds that can contain liquid only, ice only, or a combination of the two. And a lot of people are not aware, I believe, that you can actually have clouds consisting of liquid down to about minus 40 degrees C in the atmosphere. But you can also, in the other extreme end, you can also have clouds consisting only of ice down to temperature, or up to temperatures close to 0 degrees C. And what controls that is entirely the existence of so-called ice nuclei. So ice nuclei are insoluble aerosol particles that can help this phase transition from liquid to ice in the atmosphere. So for temperatures larger than minus 40, so in this mixed phase cloud temperature regime, droplets cannot freeze spontaneously. They rely on the existence of these, or the presence of these ice nuclei, to aid the phase transition, and it can happen through various pathways that I'm showing here. However, when you get to temperatures colder than minus 40, droplets can freeze, and these are solution droplets. They're not pure water, but they can have various solutes in them, or they will always have various solutes in them. But they can freeze spontaneously when you get down to temperatures colder than minus 40, but that process still requires relatively high supersaturations over ice. And so because of that, there's still a role to play for ice nuclei, insoluble aerosols, at these much colder temperatures also. So the reason for that is that the way we think about cloud formation in the atmosphere, you have a rising air parcel that cools down, and as it cools, the supersaturation rises. And if you're talking about an ice cloud now, a cirrus cloud, once you get to the point where ice crystals form, those ice crystals will then start to grow and deplete water vapor, and from that point on, you bring supersaturation down. So if this was a case of homogeneous nucleation, where droplets freeze spontaneously, you would require the supersaturation to reach about 50% before you could have ice crystal formation and bring supersaturation down again. But in the presence of ice nuclei, you can actually have ice forming much earlier than at 50% supersaturation. At supersaturations close to not much above 0, in fact. And if you do have these ice nuclei present, you can prevent homogeneous freezing altogether. You can prevent those solution droplets from forming ice crystals altogether, because those few ice crystals forming on ice nuclei deplete water vapor, and you never get to these very high supersaturations. All right, so what kind of particles in the atmosphere can act as ice nuclei? The candidates are black carbon, which we already heard a lot about, and also biological particles and mineral dust. So here, nice images of black carbon. Black carbon is very abundant in the atmosphere, very high number concentrations, but they're not very efficient ice nuclei. And in fact, lab people still argue about whether or not they can act as ice nuclei. biological particles, here's an example of Pseudomonas syringae, a bacteria, which is extremely efficient at forming ice in the atmosphere. Can form ice almost up, not much below 0 degrees C. So it's extremely efficient. Some of these biological particles are extremely efficient ice nuclei, but there are just not enough of them. The reason for that is that they're actually quite large, so they will have a hard time getting transported far enough away or high enough in the atmosphere to encounter ice clouds. And then there's perhaps the happy medium of mineral dust. They're medium efficient ice nuclei, and they have medium abundance, but there's evidence that these are the mineral dust are the most important ice nuclei in the atmosphere, the most abundant natural ice nuclei in the atmosphere. But all of these, the subset of these aerosol groups that can act as ice nuclei are rare. So a key point here in this talk is that ice nuclei are very rare in the atmosphere. We don't have many of them. And so people have started thinking about, since these natural ice nuclei are so rare, what would happen if we added artificial ice nuclei to the atmosphere? What would that do to the atmosphere? And people have then started thinking about how you could take advantage of this for the purpose of climate engineering or geoengineering. So before I introduce this geoengineering mechanism that I'm going to address in this talk, I want to just briefly review how clouds affect our radiation budget. So, clouds contribute to the greenhouse effect of the atmosphere, about 30 watts per meter square. And they also contribute to Earth's planetary albedo, and that effect tends to win in the global mean. So clouds increase the scattering of solar radiation back to space by about 50 watts per meter squared. And so the total is still a cooling in the global mean, but not all clouds are the same in this context. So for example, low clouds have a really high albedo and very efficiently scatter sunlight back to space. So that's a strong cooling effect, but they're not as efficient at trapping long-wave radiation because of their temperatures. So these clouds have a very strong cooling effect, but these high ice clouds are essentially transparent to solar radiation. So they let most of the solar radiation through to the surface. But they have very low temperatures, and that makes them very efficient at trapping long-wave radiation. So these clouds have a very strong warming effect. And so for geoengineering purposes, people have been thinking about how you can take advantage of these cloud effects on climate if you wanted to artificially cool climate. And so many people have been working on, in the modeling world, on increasing the amount or reflectivity of low clouds so that you could cool climate that way. But another way of doing it would be to decrease the amount of high clouds that have a warming effect on climate. And so that's the mechanism that I'll be addressing next. So for cirrus clouds, I was talking about two ways that they can form, either through homogeneous nucleation, where solution droplets freeze spontaneously when you get to very high supersaturations. But they can, if they form in the presence of ice nuclei, what happens is that ice crystals form on those ice nuclei at low supersaturation, and you prevent the supersaturations that are required for droplets to freeze spontaneously. And the cirrus cloud that results in those two different cases are very different. So in the one case, you form a cirrus cloud that contains many, many small ice crystals, because there are very many solution droplets around that can freeze in the upper troposphere. But if you do have ice nuclei present, they are never in high abundance. So you'd form a cirrus cloud that contains few and large ice crystals. So what this schematic is supposed to show is that this cloud is optically much thicker and therefore has a stronger warming effect than this cloud. Another issue is that these ice crystals will be sedimenting out of the cloud, and the cloud will be removed much faster and have a shorter lifetime in the upper troposphere compared to this cloud. So in 2009, Mitchell and Finnegan took advantage of this difference between these two types of clouds and said, well, could cirrus clouds be artificially converted from this type of cloud, which we think is the dominant in the current climate, to this type of cloud? And by doing that, could we then cool the climate? And they also proposed an artificial ice nuclei that you could inject into the upper troposphere. They proposed bismuth triiodide, which is a very efficient ice nuclei at very cold temperatures, not as efficient at warmer temperatures, which so we could avoid effects on warmer clouds. So we decided then to test this idea that they came up with, and this geoengineering mechanism sort of adds to a group of already large group of geoengineering mechanisms that have been proposed. So you guys will already recognize some of the mechanisms that I'm showing here. An example is carbon sequestration. People have been suggesting that we could put reflecting mirrors in orbit around Earth and reflect sunlight that way, and that way we could cool climate. And also it's been proposed that we could put aerosols in the stratosphere. This was the idea that Paul Crutzen, Nobel Prize winner, proposed a few years back, and that received a lot of attention, perhaps because of that. And there's been extensive study in climate models since then of this geoengineering mechanism here. But this new geoengineering mechanism that involves ice clouds has not really received much attention, or hasn't been carefully studied yet, and we thought we'd fix that. So we ran model simulations. I'm not going to go into details about the model, because I think I'll put you to sleep that way. I only want to say that we used the NCAR CAM5 atmospheric global model, and we put in some new parameterizations, some new treatment of cirrus clouds and the way that homogeneous and heterogeneous ice nucleation competes for water vapor in the upper troposphere. So we had that represented in the model. And if you want to know more about the model, then feel free to ask. And so what we did in the model then, we first ran control simulations allowing only homogeneous nucleation to take place, because at the time when we did this work, that was the general wisdom, was that cirrus clouds formed mostly through droplets freezing spontaneously, so with homogeneous nucleation. And then we experimented with what the optimal amount of artificial ice nuclei would be that would give us this kind of effect that Mitchell and Finnegan proposed in 2009. And so with this optimal concentration of ice nuclei, we could in fact simulate a strong reduction in cirrus cloud ice nuclei. So this is now a zonal mean, and this is height given with pressure. So strong reduction in ice crystal amount at cirrus levels. And therefore, each ice crystal became larger, but then that allowed them to sediment out much faster. So we got a lot less ice in the upper troposphere, and also a strong reduction in cloud coverage in the upper troposphere. So it was exactly the kind of effect that Mitchell and Finnegan proposed that, that could cool climate. And so we did also find a strong cooling of climate in response to these changes. So here I'm showing the effect on the radiation budget as a function of seeding concentrations. And I'm showing that for a few different simulations that vary the treatment of small-scale dynamics in the upper troposphere. But they generally behave the same way. So when you put in low concentrations of artificial ice nuclei, it doesn't really do anything, because there are not enough of them to suppress supersaturation enough that you don't get homogeneous nucleation. But then as you start increasing the concentration of seeding ice nuclei, you start cooling, because of the effects that I showed on the previous slide. You start cooling, and you are now actually able to suppress homogeneous nucleation, so all ice crystals form on the artificial ice nuclei. And then you reach a maximum cooling for an optimal seeding amount, or an optimal seeding concentration. And after that, if you keep increasing your seeding ice nuclei concentrations, what happens is you cross you cross zero here and you actually get a warming rather than a cooling. So it's the opposite of what you wanted in the first place. So there's this Goldilocks situation where too little doesn't give you any effect. Too much gives you the opposite effect. It gives you a warming rather than a cooling. And then just the right amount of seeding ice nuclei will give you quite a lot of cooling. So this is a cooling that overwhelms the warming that we've had from increasing CO2 concentration since pre-industrial times. So this is quite a substantial cooling that you could get through this mechanism. And so that led me and my co-authors to publish this paper earlier this year where we said, yes, cirrus cloud seeding has potential to cool climate. What happened shortly there, and keep in mind that these simulations relied on the assumption that cirrus clouds in the present atmosphere form homogeneously. The cirrus clouds don't form on ice nuclei, but they form on droplets that freeze spontaneously when you get high enough supersaturations. Well, shortly after we published this paper, a former colleague of mine, Dan Sitso, published this paper in Science, reporting from field campaigns where they had sampled ice crystals and analyzed, did a chemical analysis of ice residuals. And essentially what you need to do here is you need to compare clear sky aerosols. So these are compositions of aerosols measured in clear sky, and then these heterogeneous ice residuals here. And so they report from 4 field campaigns, and from each of the 4 field campaigns, they found in the ice crystal residuals, they found a very strong enrichment of dust. So dust is a brown category here. And as you go from clear sky to heterogeneous ice residuals, you see a very strong increase in dust. And so based on their analysis, they said, no, you know what, opposite of the sort of general wisdom up until this point, we find that in 94% of our cloud encounters, clouds did not form homogeneously. They did not form by droplets freezing spontaneously. They probably formed on dust particles. Seeing this publication, I thought, oh, great, I'm going to now have to write another paper in the same year contradicting my first paper and say something like, as it turns out, no, cirrus has no potential to cool climate. All right, so we started the sad project of running the simulations that would make this paper that contradicted our previous work. So now I'm presenting work that I had a wonderful visiting student from ETH actually here this summer, and she did amazingly well. And so I'm now presenting a lot of her work. And so what I'm showing here are, again, simulations from the same model. And now we allowed in the unperturbed, the unseeded atmosphere, we allowed some dust also to act as ice nuclei. So I'm showing 2 cases here. The upper row is for 5% of dust particles being active as ice nuclei, and the lower row is 50% of the dust particles being active as ice nuclei. And this fraction that I'm showing for summer here and winter here shows what fraction of ice crystals formed on dust versus, relative to the total ice crystal concentration. And so you can see that we find in both these simulations, we find a balance between the two. It's not black or white, as it never really is. It's a balance between heterogeneous and homogeneous nucleation. And what happens is that there's more heterogeneous nucleation in the summer, and there are 2 reasons for that. It's warmer, and when it's warmer, that favors heterogeneous nucleation over homogeneous nucleation, and there's more dust in summer than in winter. So the heterogeneous fraction is much higher in summer than in winter. But the key point here is that both of these simulations are actually compatible with the findings of my former colleague, where those field campaigns were made over North and Central America. And we find that these simulations agree with those measurements, but we also find that there's still quite an amount of homogeneous nucleation happening in these simulations. So then we went ahead and did seeding of a group of simulations. So we had now the same old homogeneous control case, and then a few cases where we had both homogeneous and heterogeneous nucleation in the control case, and we just varied the amount of dust that could act as an ice nuclei. And then we have one where we said in the present atmosphere, all ice crystals form on dust in cirrus clouds. And so for all these simulations that have a mix of homogeneous and heterogeneous nucleation, we could actually get almost as much cooling as we had in the pure homogeneous case that we had in our first publication. So we actually could still say that, yes, cirrus seeding has the potential to cool climate. We got a little less cooling here in the mid-latitudes of the northern hemisphere where we have the most dust and therefore had the less ideal starting point for seeding. But there's still substantial cooling for all these cases. Now, if we do have an atmosphere right now where all ice crystals form heterogeneously, then seeding would be a very bad idea because you'd actually get a warming instead of a cooling. So again, that's something we would want to be sure of before we went ahead and seeded. And again, you can also see that we get the maximum, because I'm now showing this cooling as a function of latitude, so we get a maximum cooling at mid and high latitudes, and very little cooling in the tropics and subtropics. In fact, sometimes we get the opposite in the tropics and subtropics. We get a warming rather than the cooling, or very little effect. So if we were ever to get to a point of implementing this geoengineering mechanism, and trust me, I'm not necessarily a proponent of that, but if we did, and we wanted to be practical, and let's say we were the ones paying for the seeding material, we would never want to seed in this region because that would be a waste of aircraft fuel and seeding material. So we definitely would want to seed high and mid latitudes if we were going to go ahead. And so why is that? Why is it that we don't see much of an effect in the tropics and subtropics? Well, it's because there is a competition when we reduce the amount of cirrus. There is a competition between the long wave effect. So we are able to reduce the greenhouse effect, which is what I'm showing here, and that amounts to cooling everywhere. But we are also reducing the albedo a little bit. The long wave effect wins on average, but the short wave effect, the effect of less solar radiation reflected back to space, maximizes where you have the most solar radiation in the first place, which is in the tropics and subtropics. So what you want to do is you want to minimize the effect of solar radiation, and you want to maximize the long wave. And so, that is the reason why you don't want to seed where you have a lot of sunlight. You want to seed where it's dark, relatively dark. So that would be the winter hemispheres and high latitudes in general. So Nadia, the visiting student, came up with these seeding functions, though, to try to think about, well, for what kind of zenith angles will we want to seed, and for what zenith angles do we not want to seed? So she tried different functions here for where we would implement seeding in our simulations and where we wouldn't. And in the end, we chose two simulations or seeding functions. Seeding function y1 corresponds to these green bars, and that also corresponds to a seeding of about 45% of the globe. And then a seeding function y2, which corresponds to seeding about 15% of the globe. And again, I'm now just showing the net cloud forcing here. So the cooling effect that it has, the effect that it has on the energy balance of the Earth. And so the blue ones here represent the old uniform seeding all over the globe. And very interestingly, when we avoid seeding in the tropics and subtropics, we could actually get more of a cooling. So we could get more of a cooling by seeding only 45% of the globe than when we seeded the whole globe. So that's a no-brainer if we ever got to the point of implementation. But even in this case of seeding 15% of the globe, you could get almost as much cooling as you did with uniform seeding all over the globe. And you get this kind of cooling for all our cases. Again, if cirrus clouds form on dust particles entirely in the present atmosphere, this seeding would be a very bad idea. All right, so finally, let me talk about climate responses to this geoengineering mechanism. So I'm now showing simulations for these two different seeding strategies. One, the upper one here, shows the cooling when you seed 45% of the globe, and the bottom one here shows the cooling when you seed 15% of the globe. And these are now from fully coupled atmosphere-ocean simulations, where the atmosphere is still, well, the whole model is still the NCAR model with some modifications done by us. And so you see a clear polar amplification, as expected. And you also see a cooling in the global mean of about 1.2 degrees Celsius. So this by far overwhelms the warming that we've seen so far due to increasing greenhouse gas concentrations, this upper panel. And then this seeding strategy where only 15% of the globe is seeded or geoengineered, we get a cooling of a little less, so 0.9 degrees C of cooling. Still a substantial cooling and something that overwhelms the warming that we've seen so far. I should add, though, that these figures come from simulations that haven't fully completed yet. So they're preliminary, but I don't expect many changes. But these simulations are actually still running, these couple simulations, to make sure that we have reached equilibrium for them. And at that point, we are also obviously going to look at effects on the hydrological cycle and so on, circulation patterns. So for now, I'm just going to show the effect on Arctic sea ice. So on the left-hand side here, I'm showing the annual cycle of Arctic sea ice. So the solid line here is the median over a 30-year period, and then there's a shading of plus and minus 2 standard deviations around it. And the dashed curve here is the minimum that we reached last year. So there was a record low reached for Arctic sea ice for the satellite era, I should add, in 2012. And then this red brownish curve is what happened this year, and not a new record minimum, but still much lower than the median. And so I'm showing here from the control simulation the same cycle. The blue curve here is the amount of Arctic sea ice in our control simulations. And you can see from this, and if you can see the numbers here, you can see that the control simulation does not keep enough Arctic sea ice. It's slightly too warm, so this minimum is a little too low for at least for what we're observing currently for Arctic sea ice. But the main point here is that when we introduce seeding, and this is again for the 45% of the globe seeded, we get a significant increase in the amount of Arctic sea ice, especially at the time of the minimum, when the minimum is reached. And here's also shown as the increase in sea ice thickness and sea ice area as a response to the seeding. And that brings me to my conclusions. So our numerical simulations show that this strategy of seeding cirrus clouds for the purpose of cooling climate does have the potential to cool by as much as 1.2 degrees Celsius. The optimal seeding amount appears to lie around 10 to 100 seeding ice nuclei per liter, but it does depend on fine-scale dynamics of the upper troposphere, which was something I didn't talk much about. Globally non-uniform seeding strategies could give as much cooling, or even actually more cooling, than seeding the whole globe. So there's no reason for seeding the whole globe if we were ever to go ahead with this geoengineering mechanism. So there are clearly some major unknowns related to this geoengineering mechanism. We're just beginning to analyze whether it's viable or not. So one issue is how would we actually build up, once we know what the optimal amount of seeding concentration is, how will we build it up? And this is something, these particles will have to be continuously replaced, right? They would sediment out and we would have to replace them with new ones. So this would involve perhaps flying drones in the upper troposphere. or something along those lines. We also need to address, not me, but the people who know about environmental fate and toxicity of different materials will need to address that if this was ever to be a viable geoengineering mechanism. Oh, and this was something that I actually took out of my talk because I decided I didn't have time, so you can ignore this last point. So I think with that, I'll finish my talk and perhaps just say that, again, that I'm not necessarily a proponent of introducing geoengineering mechanisms, but I could imagine that we find ourselves at some point in a situation where the alternative may be worse, and at that point, it's important to me that we've done careful analysis of these different geoengineering mechanisms in a laboratory where we can do no harm, and that's a global climate model, and so that's what we're doing. Thank you.